So usually whenever I'm researching teams or players for videos I make, I always find myself using the website sportsreference.com. And I swear I'll get lost for hours just looking at every single season a football program has ever had. I say all this to say that when I'm recording from time to time, I'll find out that a program, for instance like Virginia Tech, had a stretch of dominance where they won 10 games or more for 8 straight seasons from 2004 to 2011. And I already knew Tech had an elite stretch, but I was so young that I honestly had no idea they had that nasty stretch of 10 win seasons. Anyway, the point of this video is to just take a look at a couple of teams who we might have forgot had some pretty dominant stretches of play and give them their flowers. Don't worry, there will be plenty more content covering teams who almost made the Natty and playoffs, etc. Oh yeah, before I forget, Happy New Year's. Be sure to comment your New Year goal down below. Mine is to stop betting on plus 400 plays. I literally bet Boise State to come back at least 3 times against Penn State. Almost did it the 4th time, no cap. Anyway, these videos take a while to make, so a like and a sub would be pimp. With all that out the way, let's jump right in. So the first team I'm going to talk about in this video is the South Carolina Cox, and more specifically their stretch from 2011 to 2013, where under head coach Steve Spurrier, the Cox would have 3 straight 11-win seasons, where they would be as close to making the BCS National Championship game as they would ever be in my lifetime. Lifelong Cox fans, don't hate me for saying that. I know in 1984 y'all were really close to winning it all, but I wasn't around back then. Anyway, starting in the year 2011, led by the quarterback whose name I bet you haven't heard in a while, Steven Garcia, the Cox would start the year off 4-0, but it wouldn't be a smooth 4 games, as a couple of those wins to start off the year would be really close against teams that the Cox were supposed to win comfortably against. A lot of this would have to do with subpar quarterback play from Garcia, and his bad QB play would culminate in the Cox' first loss of the season to the Auburn Tigers. After that loss, head coach Steve Spurrier would make a switch at quarterback, deciding to move forward with Connor Shaw. The switch would have immediate results, as the Cox would rail off 3 straight wins, although I will admit 2 of those wins they only managed to put up 14 points. But hey, as long as you're winning, right? At this point in the season, the Gamecocks were sitting at 7-1 and ranked 9th in the country, going into a huge matchup with the 7th ranked Razorbacks. South Carolina would be within 2 points at one point in the 4th quarter, but would end up losing the game 44-28 to the Razorbacks, and a lot of that was due to turning the ball over 4 times. You can't win SEC ball turning the ball over that many times. The Cox would end the 2011 season winning 4 straight games against my Gators, the Citadel, 17th ranked Clemson, and finally to end the season, a win in the Capital One Bowl against the 20th ranked Nebraska Cornhuskers, bringing the Cox final record of the 2011 season to 11-2, their most wins in a single season ever up to that point. Coming into 2012, the 9th ranked Cox were expected to be competing for the SEC title and a Natty berth this year, and to start the season off, it felt like this 2012 squad was the one, as in their first 5 games of the season, South Carolina was playing some of the best ball this program has ever seen, minus the first game, as they would only beat the powerhouse Vanderbilt squad 17-13, but every other game during their first 5-game stretch of the season, they would dominate and win pretty easily, bringing the Cox record to 5-0 and their spot in the latest polls to the 6th spot in the country, going into their huge SEC East matchup with the 5th ranked Georgia Bulldogs. Their game versus the Bulldogs would be one of the best games any Gamecock team has ever played, as they would go up early 21-0, putting their their foot all over the Bulldogs' necks and not giving them any chance of coming back, as they would win this matchup 35-7. After the ginormous win, South Carolina would move up all the way to the 3rd spot, and were starting to make major progress on their quest for a SEC title and a national championship game berth. Unfortunately, most highest highs are followed by the lowest lows, as the Cox would lose 2 straight games after being ranked as high as the 3rd spot in the country, falling to LSU 23-21 and to my Florida Gators 44-11. Those 2 tough losses back-to-back would somehow only drop the Cox ranking in the polls to the 13th spot, but we all know the voters love them some SEC football, so I can't really be surprised. Anyway, I don't know what is up with these South Carolina teams ending the season off hot, but this 2012 squad would do that exact same thing, as they would end the season on a 5-game winning streak, which included wins against 11th ranked Clemson and 18th ranked Michigan in the Outback Bowl, putting South Carolina's final record on the season at 11-2 once again for the 2nd time in a row, with them finishing at the 8th spot in the country in the final AP poll rankings. And here's a cool fact to throw your way: the Cox were on an 11-game home winning streak going into the final year of this dominant stretch. Alright, so in 2013, South Carolina came into the season ranked as the 6th best team in the country, so once again this Cox squad was expected to do big things this season. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for things to spiral out of control, as in only their 2nd game of the season they would lose 41-30 to the 11th ranked Georgia Bulldogs. This loss would push the Cox back 7 spots, as they would drop from the 6th spot in the polls to the 13th spot. Credit to South Carolina, because they would bounce back winning games versus teams such as Vanderbilt, UCF, Kentucky, and Arkansas, giving the Cox much needed momentum and slowly moving them back up the polls. However, against an unranked 3-3 Tennessee squad, South Carolina would play with their food, letting the Vols hang around long enough, leading to a last-second field goal as time expired. That loss would pretty much end the Cox natty hope, but like every other year during this little stretch, the Cox would finish the season off extremely strong, starting with an overtime win 27-24 on the road against the 5th ranked 7-0 Missouri Tigers, and then dealing with foes Mississippi State, Florida, and Coastal Carolina, and to end the regular season, an impressive win against the 6th ranked 10-1 Clemson Tigers. You already know the Cox would win their bowl game, because that's exactly what they would do every year during these 3 years, as they would defeat 19th ranked Wisconsin in the Capital One Bowl 34-24, ending their season 11-2 for the 3rd year in a row, with their final ranking in the polls being at the 4th spot. All in all, during this stretch, the Cox were one of those teams who legitimately could have snuck into into the Natty and won if a couple of things went different. But I just felt like I had to mention this little 3-year stretch of ball from the Gamecocks because they were really an elite program during this window, winning 3 straight bowl games, having 3 straight 11-win seasons, and ending each of those seasons ranked in the top 10 during the last AP poll of the season. From one forgotten elite program, we move on to another one that I have to mention, and that is the West Virginia Mountaineers, and more specifically their run from the year 2005 to 2007 under head coach Rich Rodriguez. So coming into this 3-year window of Natty contention, the Mountaineers had been building momentum under head coach Rich Rodriguez for the past 3 seasons prior to the year 2005, as they would finish each of those seasons with 8 wins or more and see themselves bouncing in and out of the AP polls. That was just a little background. Anyway, entering the 2005 season, West Virginia would come into the year unranked, and even after pulling out 4 wins against teams such as Syracuse, Wofford, Maryland, and East Carolina, the Mountaineers would still find themselves unranked. However, that might have been because they didn't really look all that impressive to start the season off. After starting off 4-0, West Virginia would run into their first test of the season at home against Mike Vick and the 3rd-ranked Virginia Tech Hokies. The Mountaineers would fight hard, but the Hokies would be just too much, winning 34-17. West Virginia would bounce back strong, defeating Rutgers 27-14 and then winning against the 19th-ranked Louisville Cardinals 46-44 in overtime. That game versus the Cardinals would be important because in that matchup, the West Virginia starting quarterback Adam Benardic would get injured, allowing a young QB by the name of Pat White to step in, and once he would take over, he would never look back, as the Mountaineers would finish the season off winning the rest of their games, defeating Connecticut, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and South Florida, culminating with the Big East title, a Sugar Bowl win against the 8th-ranked Georgia Bulldogs, putting West Virginia's final record on the season at 11-1, and their final poll rankings at the 5th spot in the country. West Virginia would carry their momentum over from the previous year, coming into 2006, they would start the season out ranked as the 5th best team in the country, and in their first 7 games of the season, they looked like a top 5 team, as they would dominate all teams that stood in their way, starting the year off 7-0, and a lot of that was due to Pat White starting the year off as the West Virginia starting quarterback, and also a career year from the All-American running back Steve Slayton. The Mountaineers were 3rd in the country going into a road game versus 7-0 5th-ranked Louisville Cardinals. This game would start out competitive and would be tight going into halftime, but once the second half hit, the Cardinals would just outplay West Virginia, winning the game 44-34. The Mountaineers would bounce back strong, winning their next 2 games easily against Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, getting their season back on track and bringing their ranking in the latest polls to the 7th spot. West Virginia was still in a prime position to make a push for the Natty, but going into their matchup with the South Florida Bulls, the Mountaineers would lay an egg. They weren't even outplayed, they just made way too many mistakes, and they would turn the ball over 5 times, losing to the Bulls 24-19. Although West Virginia's title hopes were out the window, they would finish off the 2006 season strong, defeating 13th-ranked Rutgers 41-39 in an overtime thriller, and defeating Georgia Tech 38-35 in the Gator Bowl, finishing the year off 11-2. To start the 2007 football season, 3rd-ranked West Virginia only had one thing on their mind, winning a Natty, and in their first 4 games of the season, they would look like a Natty contender, blowing out Western Michigan, Marshall, Maryland, and East Carolina. 4-0, West Virginia would be going into their first real test of the season, a game on the road against the 18th-ranked 4-0 South Florida Bulls. Just like in the previous season, the Mountaineers would lose to the Bulls, and once again, they would lose the turnover battle, turning the ball over 6 times, ultimately costing them the game 21-13. The whole entire team would take this tough and honestly embarrassing loss personal, and would bounce back, winning 6 games in a row against foes Syracuse, Mississippi State, Rutgers, Louisville, 22nd-ranked Cincinnati, and finally the 20th-ranked Connecticut Huskies. At one point, it looked like the West Virginia season was over, but after grinding it out, they were back in the conversation of teams competing for a Natty, as they would be sitting at 10-1 and would be ranked as the number 2 team in the entire country. So all they had to literally do was win their last game of the season against a 4-7 below-average Pittsburgh squad. Unfortunately, the 2nd-ranked West Virginia Mountaineers would fall 13-9, shutting the door on West Virginia's chances of playing in the 2007 BCS National Championship game. And the most insane part about all this is that I really think if West Virginia would have beat Pitt, I think they had a good chance of winning it all. But in reality, West Virginia would have to settle for sharing a Big East title with UConn and playing in the Fiesta Bowl against the 4th-ranked OU Sooners. The Mountaineers would blow out the Sooners, winning 48-28 and finishing off their season 11-2, giving them their 3rd 11-win season in a row. All in all, 2 conference championships, 2 BCS bowl game wins, and competing for a Natty for 3 straight years is pretty good. Obviously, it would have been crazy if they could have pulled it out in 2007, but it just wasn't meant to be, I guess. But yeah, I just wanted to show West Virginia a little love because during these 3 years, the Mountaineers were really one of those premier college football programs, in my opinion. Alright, so for the last program we're going to be talking about in this video, I'm sure it's going to shock you. Anyway, for the last entry, we're going to be looking at Washington State's stretch of dominance from 2001 till 2003, where this somewhat slept-on program would finish each of those years ranked in the top 10 during the final AP poll of the season. Coming into this stretch, head coach Mike Price was coming off some of his worst seasons coaching for the program, as in their previous 3 seasons, the Washington State Cougars would go 4-7, 3-9, and 3-8. Also, I have to mention that entering the 2001 football season, Washington State was predicted to finish tied for last in the Pac-10 with Arizona. To start the 2001 football season, the people who made the preseason predictions for Washington State would look stupid right away, as the Cougars would roar out the gate, winning their first 4 games in a pretty dominant fashion, blowing out Idaho, Boise State, California, and Arizona. I will say, after winning 4 games to open up the season, the Cougars would have a test in Game 5 against Oregon State. That would be close, but Wazoo would come out on top 34-27, led by a monster game from running back Dave Minnick, who would carry the rock for 195 yards with 1 touchdown. While that matchup was tough, their next matchup would be tougher. They would be facing off against their first ranked matchup of the season against the 23rd ranked Stanford Cardinal. Wazoo would come out on top 45-39, and after the huge win would enter the polls for the first time all season, being ranked at the 19th spot in the country. After an easy win against Montana State, Wazoo would be hosting Oregon in a top 15 matchup. The Cougars would give it their all, but Oregon would just have too much talent and would hand Washington State their first loss for the season. Wazoo would bounce back in a big way, defeating the 9th-ranked UCLA Bruins 20-14. And I have to shout out the Washington State defense because they would force UCLA to turn the ball over 7 times, led by a 4-interception day from Lamont Thompson. And I also have to shout out the future All-Pro NFL quarterback Marcus Trufant. He had a pick as well. Wazoo was back on track after that win and would keep it up, winning against Arizona State in their next game, bringing their record to 9-1 and their ranking in the polls to the 9th spot. Sadly, in the Apple Cup versus Washington, the Cougars would lose, but would bounce back, beating Purdue in the Sun Bowl, finishing the 2001 season 10-2. 2002 would see Washington State starting the year ranked 12th in the country, and this year the program had a whole lot of hype behind them. As in most Pac-10 preseason predictions, the media had the Cougars finishing first in the conference, and this time around the media was dead on. So to start the season, Wazoo would open up with 2 tune-up games that they would easily win, defeating Nevada 31-7 and Idaho 49-14. 2-0 and moving up to the 10th spot in the country, Washington State was coming up on honestly their biggest test of the season by far, a matchup on the road against the 6th-ranked Ohio State Buckeyes. Wazoo would jump out early, being up 7-3 going into the second quarter, but the Buckeyes would dominate the rest of the game from there, handing the Cougars their first loss of the season 25-7. When taking a closer look at this game, it was clear that Wazoo just couldn't handle the Buckeyes up front, as the Ohio State O-line was manhandling them, allowing the Buckeyes to rush for nearly 300 yards, highlighted by a monster day from the future NFL running back Maurice Claret, who would total 230 yards on the ground on his own. The loss was tough, but Washington State would bounce back, winning against Cal and pulling out a close one against the 18th-ranked USC Trojans and future NFL quarterback Carson Palmer, 30-27. Shout out to Wazoo's starting quarterback Jason Gesser, as he would keep up with Carson Palmer, putting up 315 yards through the air with 2 touchdowns. Homie was a huge part of this massive win. This win would move the Cougars up from the 17th spot to the 12th spot, and they would keep the momentum up, defeating Stanford, Arizona, 16th-ranked Arizona State, and finally 15th-ranked Oregon. 9-1, the Cougars were now sitting at the 3rd spot in the country. Yes, you heard that right, the 3rd spot in the country, going into the Apple Cup against the Washington Huskies. Once again, the Cougars would lose in the Apple Cup in a close game, 26-29. 9-2 and ranked at the 7th spot in the country, Washington State would blow out UCLA 48-27 in their final regular season game of the season to clinch a share of the Pac-10 title with USC and earn a spot in the Rose Bowl against the 8th-ranked Oklahoma Sooners. Washington State would get boat raced in the Rose Bowl, losing 34-14, finishing the year 10-3. But something that I want to mention before we move on to 2003 is that even though Washington State was ranked 3rd at one point in the season, they never really had a chance to make the Natty, as this was the year Miami and Ohio would match up in the big game, and both teams would be undefeated going into it. Coming into 2003, even though the Cougars had an amazing season the year before, for some reason they wouldn't be ranked in the preseason top 25. Maybe because there was a new head coach in town named Bill Doba, I don't know. But boy, did the media get this one wrong. Anyway, to start the year, the Cougars would win an easy game against Idaho, setting them up for their first test of the season, a road game against 19th-ranked Notre Dame. The game would be a battle, and it would take an extra quarter to decide a winner, but sadly, Washington State would fall just short, 29-26, in overtime to the Fighting Irish. It was a tough early loss, but Wazoo would respond like a champion, going off on a 6-game winning streak, which included wins against 17th-ranked Colorado on the road, an easy win against New Mexico, a blowout on the road 55-16 against the 10th-ranked Oregon Ducks, and then wins against Arizona, Stanford, and Oregon State. Washington State was now sitting at 7-1 and had moved all the way up in the polls to the 6th spot in the country, going into another road game against the 3rd-ranked USC Trojans. Man, literally every tough game Washington had this season just happened to be on the road. But yeah, of course they would lose this game, and honestly it wasn't even close. They would get blown out 43-16. But let's be real, this USC team would end up sharing the title with LSU, so it would have been a super tough win to pull off regardless. The Cougars would bounce back from that tough loss and win 2 games in a row, beating UCLA and Arizona State. But once again, for the 3rd time during this stretch of play from the Cougars, Washington State would lose to Washington in the Apple Cup 27-19, bringing the Cougars' record on the season to 9-3. Wazoo would end this year on a high note though, as they would defeat the 6th-ranked Texas Longhorns 28-20 in the Pacific Life Holiday Bowl, putting their final record on the season at 10-3. From 2001 to 2003, the Cougars would win 10 games each year. They would win a conference title, take home 2 bowl games, and finish each of the seasons ranked in the top 10. Easily one of their best stretches in program history, and a more underrated one in the college football zeitgeist. Anyway, that's a wrap for the video. If you have any teams or players you want me to cover, be sure to let me know down below in the comments. I'm out.